Welcome back. So today I thought we'll go through a bunch of hotkeys that you would probably be using um, as you're sculpting because they're pretty commonly used, as well as just some general tips and tricks when sculpting in ZBrush. The first thing to note is the undo button. So that's probably something that we'll be doing a lot. If I just make a stroke here on this ball, just like this, you'll probably notice as I start sculpting, at the top here, we have this little bar. And every time I make a stroke, just like that, you can see this bar adds another notch to the end. Now, this is your undo history. So you can see if I hover over this, we have 22 undo histories and it has a timestamp, which is great. And what this is good for is that if there was a time much earlier than this and I want to get back to that, instead of pressing Control Z, which is your general sort of undo hotkey, you can see this little slider jumping backwards. I can just drag this to a point where I'm happy with. Okay, so this is great because we can really sort of shift this across and sort of see the changes happening. And if we want to take it back to an area, let's say over here, that we're happy with, we can just leave it as that. One thing to remember when we're doing this is that if I move this slider all the way back to, let's say here, and then I want to sculpt again, you just got to be sure that that's where you want to leave it, because as soon as I make any sort of changes here, just as you saw, it deleted all of those undos in front of it. So it starts from a new starting point basically, which is over here. Some tools will give you the notification, a warning to tell you that it's going to delete your undo history. But when you're just sculpting, if you bring something back and you start sculpting like this, it will delete everything that was in front of it. Now, that's not the only thing that we can do with the undo history, or the only thing that's special with this. There's another thing that's pretty cool, but it's also something that you have to understand as well, is that each subtool has its own undo history. So we can see with this one here, with this ball, we have 11 undos. Now, if I go over to the right here in my tool palette, open up the subtool palette. If I just go down to the bottom here to where it says append, and let's just add a cylinder. Just move this across. So I'm just going to press W, bring this across. You'll see that we have a new bar here. This red one, I'm not too sure what this is. This just sort of came in as I started this. It probably means something bad, but so far hasn't done anything. But you can see that if I hold down Alt and select the ball here, we have all of these undos all the way up to here. If I select the cylinder, you can see that we have no undos, or we have like 2 or 3. So I can move things around like this. You can see I can add to that, and each object has its own undo history. So something to keep in mind. I think that's pretty much all we need to know with undos for now. Remember, the main hotkey for that is Control Z. We have a slider bar up here that that keeps track of our undos. We can slide this bar along, which is great. One thing to keep in mind, when you're at a really high poly and you've got hundreds of undo histories, this can get a bit laggy. So you kind of don't really want to do this unless you are sure that you want to do this. And also that each subtool has its own undo history. Right? It's not a universal thing. Okay, so the other thing that we want to know, so I'm just going to start a new scene. Let's not save this. Got this little red bar here. I'm not too sure what that is, but it's not causing me any issues. Let's see. So we want to, bring up the gizmo. That was pressing W, E, or R on the keyboard. The general hotkeys for resizing your brush is S for size. So Q is to go back to your edit. Q is to jump back to this draw mode. S is to resize your brush. That's a very important one. U is for your intensity. As you can see, bring that all the way down. Doesn't do anything. O is for your focal shift. That's like your fall off or your softness or hardness of the brush. And then another one we haven't really spoken about is your symmetry tool. So this is something we'll be doing quite often, is working symmetrical. And you can see that on the left-hand side of this model, I have a little red dot. That's basically the mirror of my brush, which has the circle around it, indicating the brush size. Now the hotkey for that is X on the keyboard. And to get to the button, if you want to adjust the symmetricalness, so right now it's on the X axis. Let's say you want to work back to front, so you want to work on the Z axis. You can come up to here in the menu bar, and I believe it's in transform. And you can see that we have symmetry over here. So I can activate the Y symmetry or the Z symmetry or a combination of either of these. Another cool thing as well, and you'll probably do a lot of this in your hard surface sculpture, is using the radial count. So a radial symmetry. So if I go back up to transform and then press this R button here for radial symmetry, I can activate the radial count. So instead of working just left to right or top to bottom, it works in a spherical motion. So over here, I can just activate this, and I can change how this works. So let's say on the Y here, and I can increase the amount of count. So right now I had it to 18. I think it was down lower, but I actually made it higher. I'll go up to the transform bar and do it here. So if I increase this to something fairly high, like 30, I can quite easily come into here and do rounded sort of shapes and things like that. So if I increase the intensity of this brush, you can see I can make these sort of effects, which is quite nice. Right, so that's the symmetry brush or the symmetry tool. It's something that we'll be using, you'll probably use often, especially just the general left to right symmetry. The radial count or the radial symmetry you'll be using in certain use cases, but very, very useful. Okay, so the other hotkey that we would be using a lot is your Shift and Alt key. So Shift on whilst having a brush on will activate the smooth. So you can see here on my right where I have the brushes, yours will be on the left, but if I hold down Shift, you can see that we start to activate the smooth brush. Now this is great for smoothing things out, as the name suggests. And when we press Shift, we get a different set of intensities and so on. So we can adjust the intensity of that smoothing as well. So very handy just to quickly smooth something out instead of going to the smooth brush in the brush palette. So remember, the brush palette is B on the keyboard. Instead of finding where smooth is, which is somewhere down here, I actually don't even know where it is. We just hold down Shift. So smooth, so BSM, I think it was, just here. So instead of pressing this brush, even if you did press it, it will just tell you that the brush is in the shift key if you want to use it. Right. The other hotkey that we'll be using a lot is your alt or your alternative brush mode, right? So right now, if I bring up the clay builder, let's work on the bottom here. I'm just going to turn that grid off, increase the brush intensity. Let's say I just sculpt something I just did before, just like that. You can see that it gives us the desired effect where the object or the surface somewhat gets extruded out, right? Just like that. Alt will do the opposite or just an alternative function. And quite often that's just the inverse of whatever the brush is doing. So if this is going out like this, if I hold down Alt, you can sort of see on my cursor there's a little minus sign. It's kind of hard to see, but now it's doing the inverse of that. I can quickly cut into this mesh fairly easily, right? And just releasing that will take it back to where it was before, right? And I can press Shift for smooth. I can smooth this out really, really quickly. Right, so another example would be I'll use the dam standard, which is your cutting brush. So if I was just to turn symmetry off, and let's just go back to your normal left to right symmetry. If I just cut into here, so by default, this brush will cut, so it will go in like that. If I hold down Alt, it will go out. Great, so a very useful thing when sculpting. And it's not just for brushes that we can use the Alt key for. I mean, it is kind of for brushes because a lot of brushes do multiple functions. So it's not just moving topology around. For example, we got the mask brush. If we hold down Control, that brings up the mask pen. And if I drag outside the model, so in this open space, it will drag a box around. If I let go of that, you can see we can mask certain areas out. And this is very helpful when it comes to just not affecting areas that we don't want affected by our sculpting. Right, so I can come into here and do all the sculpting I want, and this area in the masked section won't get affected. I can hold down Control and tap in the open space. And what that will do is that will invert my selection. So sometimes it's easier to grab, let's say, this section here, and then press Control, tap in the open space to invert that selection like so, right? Rather than to try to grab all of this section first. Great, so if I wanted to deselect my mask, all I need to do is press Control and drag a little box in the open space, and that will deselect the mask for me. Now, the mask function has different modes to it depending on what you're doing. So with this one, this mask pen, if I drag a box in the open space, it will drag a box, right? I can also, one thing I forgot to mention is that if I press spacebar, I can rearrange the location of that box. So I don't have to get it perfect in the one go. Let's say, for example, I want to create a box selection over this centerpiece. That'll be very difficult because it will be like a three-step motion where I grab all of this, then hold down Alt, which is the opposite. In this case, I'll be minusing from the mask. So it's Control Alt to minus and do something like that, which that would work, but that's a couple extra steps. Or I can do this where I hold down Control, drag a little box, press spacebar, and just bring that over. And if I release spacebar, I can continue to adjust that selection, right? And if I let go, it will make that selection. So that's a very useful function there. And another thing with the masking, if I hold down Control and tap in the mask itself, it will blur that mask out. So that can be very useful when we're trying to make a selection for like to pose something essentially, right? Great. Just move this out. Another thing that we can do and we'll be using a lot is our select react tool or rect tool. That is like our selection tool. So selection rectangle. I have a button set here for that, but by default, it should be set to your Control Shift key. So if I press Control Shift, it will activate the select rectangle tool. If it's not here, it's just a brush. So you can press B, S, and E. Well, BSR, sorry, which is this one here. And if I press that, it will tell me that that brush is assigned to the Control Shift key. So what this does is that I can drag, just like as if I was doing on the mask, a square over a section. So let's say I want to grab the centerpiece here, and I can isolate that part of the mesh, which is very, very handy. I can also press Control Shift Alt and do the invert of that. So let's say I want to do something like this, and that will make things easy as well. So sometimes you got to use a combination of this. If I could press Control Shift and drag a little box, it will invert that selection. And if I press Control Shift and tap, it will take me back to the default. So very handy. If I press Control Shift just to go through that again, I can highlight certain areas that I want to keep in view. So let's just say here. And if I make any changes in this mode, so let's say I move something around like this, and then I go back to the default view, you can see that everything that wasn't in that view is still in the same spot. So this is a great way for isolating certain things to make to separate it. It's kind of like masking in a way, except it's you can hide things, so you can easily get behind an object and inside something. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention with the masking tool is if I were to press Control and instead of going off my mesh or into the open space like this, if I was to hold Control and start on top of the mesh itself, I can paint in this masking. Right, and the Alt function works the same here as well. So if I press Alt, I can minus from that mask. Right. So I can, carefully grab certain areas that I want to grab, like here. Invert that. Do whatever I want with that. Okay. One thing as well is that when you press Control, you can come up to your brush option here. If I open that up, there's all these different variations of this sort of brush. So you can see here I have a mask circle. So instead of doing what I did earlier where I sort of manually masked out the circle here, if I know that's a perfect circle, I can press Control, go to the brush option, and remember yours will be on the left. I can go to mask circle and it will work exactly the same. Right. Okay. So just remember these are here. We can use them, and very powerful. And again, if I press Control Shift, there's more options or more variations of this brush within the brush tooltip here, or the brush options here. Let's see, what else is there? There's smoothing groups, or poly groups, I should say. If I press Shift F, that will bring up my wireframes essentially. And the colors here are quite important when we are working in ZBrush. So the color assigned to these polygons is called a poly group. So you can see that here in the tool palette. If I scroll down a little bit, you'll find poly groups. And these are all the different things we can do with poly groups. Now, this is how we can assign poly groups. But what's important is that poly groups it's almost like a way we can quickly select certain areas. So let's say, for example, I want to be able to highlight this circle area quite easily. Well, I can make a poly group out of that, and it will allow me to sort of grab this area or do other things to it. So for example, if I was to Z remesh this, or do an auto retopology to this mesh, which is something that we would do often in ZBrush, not for a final product, but more just to clean up the mesh. If I wanted to keep this circular shape intact, quite often I would make a poly group out of the circle shape and tell ZBrush to say, hey, when I'm retopologizing this mesh, look at the curvature of the poly group and use that to help you define where we put the topology. So to do that, there's a couple different things we can do. So you can see here, we can group by mask, group by poly paint. There's whole lots of things that we can do to this. Grouping by mask, or poly grouping by mask, is something that I do often. So if I press Control and bring up my masking tool, I can either manually paint this or go to the brush options here, and let's say pick the mask circular. And if I drag out this, if I drag out this mask, let's press spacebar to resize that or reposition that. Let's say I want to grab just this section here. What I can do is then mask or make a poly group by the masked areas. So if I press that, and now if I press Shift F again, you can see that we have this poly group, which is great because we can now then isolate the poly group from itself or from everything else. So for example, now if I press Control Shift and just tap on this poly group, I can isolate these poly groups out, which is really, really cool actually. Likewise, I can do it up here as well. All right. I can invert that, and I can use this poly group to define certain features. So for example, if I come up to the tool panel here, or tool palette, and let's go to my geometry tab. If I scroll down a little bit, we can go to our edge looping or edge loops. And from here, I can make a loop from the poly groups. So if I click that, okay, so it doesn't have any, it's got subdivisions, so I might delete the lower subdivisions here. And I press group loops. You can see that I can loop out this section here. All right, so let's try that again. So let's group loops here. And you can see it's created these extra lines on my model. Now this is a pretty messy model, so it's not going to give me the best results, but you can see that we have this these lines here, which is great because we can use that to help us define like hard surface corners and things like that. What I can do is just subdivide this a couple more times. And then over here, I'm just going to go into my deformations and just polish by groups. So what this does is that ideally you should try to smooth this out. Let's see if I can divide this a couple more times. So polish by groups. So it might be too high res for this. So let's try that again, delete higher. And oops. So delete higher here. Let's try to isolate this. And then if I go to my deformation tabs and try to smooth, polish by groups, I can sort of smooth this out. And let's see what else I can do. So what I can do is split hidden now because I can easily hide this object here. So split. So what I can do is go into my subtool here, it's my subtool palette, and then go to split and split hidden, which will leave me with two subtools. And then over here with this subtool, just going to reduce that. If I go to my geometry tab again, and instead of group loops, I might use like edge loops or panel loops or something. And what this does is that it will, so if I can press this button here, that will solo my object. It'll give me like a little bit of thickness to this panel, which is great. And I can adjust the thickness here. So I will need to adjust the thickness and then press panel loops again. Let's pick something reasonable like that. And then if I get out of solo mode, go back into here, I can do the same sort of thing, right? So I'm just going to press Control Shift. Oh, not Control Shift. I'm just going to solo this. And then I can say, let's panel loop this again, which will give it this sort of thickness to it. Now, if I come back out, I've got these sort of, again, it's very rough because I didn't really spend some time there. But what I was able to do is basically isolate these two areas and make these edges suitable for like a crease. So now if I was to subdivide this a number of times, so let's say this centerpiece here. So the subdivision hotkey is Control D. I'll keep this nice crisp edge that we made earlier. And I might do the same for here. Let's subdivide this section. So we get this nice crisp edge. Maybe not the best example because it doesn't look too great. And that's because I started off with a very low polygon and I didn't really do anything to clean this up. But what I was able to do is quickly isolate these sort of things out, which is awesome. So they're polygroups. We can do a lot more than what I've just shown you. Let's say quickly I'll show you this. I'll just delete the higher here of this object. Might hide this extra little piece here. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna delete everything. Just start a new one. That might be easier. Oops. Okay, so we got this circle again. Let's say I create a polygroup here. So I press Control to bring up my mask. Might drag out a circle here and do this. Now, actually, before I do that, I might copy this. So I might just highlight or go to my move tool, which is W on the keyboard. Go to my subtool palette and press duplicate and just bring this across. And if I was to then press Control and drag out a mask circle and just mask out an area like this. And I might just do the front only. I can make a polygroup from this selection here. So I can go into my subtool palette again and go to masking. And not masking, sorry, my polygroup. And then go to group mask, or the hotkey is Control W. You can sort of see that. I don't like that color because it's too close to the other polygroup. So I'm going to press Control Z and press Control W again. And just do that a number of times until I get a color that's very different, right? Okay, so let's go to this sphere as an example. Quite often, like I said, when we're doing ZBrush sort of stuff, we want to remesh or auto retopo the mesh often. And that's just so we can keep the topology nice and clean when we're working. To do that, we go to our tool panel and go to geometry, open this up, and then find Z remesher, right? What I can do here is just run exactly what this says. So I can, instead of going to adaptive, I'm just going to go to same. So it's going to keep roughly the same poly count as what I had here. I can see the poly count up here in the toolbar here. So we've got active points, which is what I have selected. So I've got about 10,000 polygons. And then in the whole scene, I got 21,000-ish, 22,000. So I'm just going to run a Z remesher. You can see that it's giving me pretty good results. But if I wanted a little bit more control, let's say I go back to this one here and say, hey, I want to Z remesh this. Except what I want to do is I want to keep, I want to use the polygroups as a guidance tool, basically. So I want the topology to sort of flow around this green polygroup here. In my Z remesher menu, I can go to this button here, which says keep groups. And then I can press Z remesh again. And you can see what Z remesher has done is that it's tried to use this polygroup as a way to sort of lay out the topology of this sphere, which is really cool, right? So if I go into my subtools and just merge this down so you can see this, you can see how different the topology looks. So polygroups is not only good for like being able to select things easier and things like that, but it's also a really, really good way of telling the auto retopology inside ZBrush to behave a certain way, right? And yeah, that's how you do it. So you sort of isolate things out and then, or mask things out like this, and then press Control W. There's plenty of ways we can do this, but most people will just do it like this. Great, so that's that. What else is there? There's, we went through symmetry, went through masking and polygroups. I guess the mirroring tools, right? So let's start a new project here, and I'm going to pick the dog. So there's ways to mirror objects. So let's say I come into here and then I append. Let's say I'm going to do the eyes. Right. I'm going to hold down Alt and tap on my sub-object, subtool. Press W, E, or R to bring up the gizmo, and then I'm just going to move this into place. Great, so we've got this eyeball here, and we just want to sort of copy this to the other side. Now there's multiple ways we can do this. I guess the more simpler method, the more not as accurate method, I guess, is just to duplicate the model here. So if I have the subtool highlighted and then press the duplicate button, which is Control-Shift-D, I can duplicate that and just move that across. You know, for simpler sort of scenes or actions, I guess this will probably be fine for the most part. Maybe not for the final model, but for the most part, this will be fine for now. So you could just do that. The other way is to hold down Control as we move this object across to the other side. It will make a copy. Now keep in mind when we do this, so if I delete this, sorry, because it's kind of confusing here. We have one object here. If I hold down Control and move this across, it will copy this subtool. One thing to note with this is that the object that we just duplicated is still in the one subtool. So we're going to have one subtool with two eyeballs, basically, like in this little preview box. When we do this, the original subtool becomes mask. So we can quickly hold down Control and move something across to duplicate something. But if we do want that separate, if we scroll down a little bit to where it says split, if we open this up, we can just split mask points or unmasked points in this case. And what that would do is split the two objects for us. So it's kind of done the same thing as just pressing this button here. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. The other option here is to go into your menu bar to where it says Z plugins. Go to your subtool master, open that up, and then we have a mirror subtool option here. So we can mirror on the X, Y, the Z. We can merge into a single subtool, or we can add a separate subtool. So if I add a separate subtool, just add another sphere down here. Let's just press that and it will just duplicate that to the other side. This middle part here, or this line in the middle, is your center line, essentially. The other way to do that duplication is to, so let's delete this copy here, is to scroll down in your tool palette to deformations. And then we have mirror. So this will just mirror the object. So just flip it back and across, which is fine. That's something that we could do. We can just copy or duplicate the object. So Control Shift D, and then mirror that across, and that does a very similar thing. Another thing that we can do is go into our geometry tab or geometry palette here, and go to modify topology. And there's also a mirror and weld tool here as well, which basically will, if I delete this subtool and then I try that again, so it was in geometry and mirror and weld, it basically will do the same thing as what we did earlier, where we duplicated the object and then mirrored it across, and then come into merge and merge visible in the subtool palette. So there's a lot of things that we can do in ZBrush that kind of you end up with the same result at the end. In this case, mirroring something. Just kind of pick whatever you think is works the best, I guess. For me, even though this is quite a simple way of doing it, just by going to geometry, modify topology, and mirror and weld, like that's a pretty simple way of mirroring something. Quite often I'll just go to Z plugin and subtool master and mirror. Even though I don't think that's the best way, but I do it anyways quite often. Okay, so that's the mirroring tool. Just trying to think of what else would be a very common way of something to know. Look, I think for now that would probably be it. I guess the other thing to sort of keep in mind is that this tool palette is very important. There's a lot of tools in here that we'll be using for this whole, for just generally working in ZBrush. You'll be working with a lot of this stuff. So just keep that in mind. The different brushes that we went through today, like the masking and the select brush, the smoothing, pressing Alt, those are all really, really important things. I think it's something that you just got to practice or just make sure that you know it's there before we get into actually sculpting. So just remember those things are there, and they're important because that's how we make things in ZBrush. We need to be able to sort of because we can't really select polygons and vertices like we do in Maya or Max. We can't actually grab all of these vertices, right, and move them around. Let's say I wanted to move the head forward. We can't just grab these vertices and move them forward. We have to either do a couple of things, or three things. Use the move brush with symmetry and make a really, really big brush and move that across, just hoping that nothing gets broken or stretched in the process, which it probably will. You might not notice, but something will get stretched. Or we could, mask certain areas out. So I'm going to go back to my mask pen. And then, invert this mask and then smooth this out and then move this across. We could do something like that. Right, even that doesn't look too good, to be honest. So if we did something like that, that could work. Or we could, do a similar sort of thing as what we had before, but then make a poly group out of it, and then, isolate this, and then move it out, right? So we could sort of do something like this where we could move it, right? But even that is probably not the best way of doing things. So just keep in mind, if we wanted to select a bunch of vertices, those are the ways that we can do it. We can't actually, we can't actually grab vertices. I mean, that we can, but not the same way as we do in Max and Maya. So the way to do that, if we want to grab a whole bunch or manipulate a whole area, is to mask it out, make a poly group of it or something like that. Right. So that's really important to understand. Okay, so I think that's it for this video. It's probably going for a bit longer than I wanted it to, but there's a lot of those little things in ZBrush that is very important when it comes to just general sculpting and manipulating your mesh, right? Right, so in the next video, we'll talk about actual sculpting techniques. See you guys then.